This is episode 43 of the Marshall Street Podcast.
You're listening to the Marshall Street Podcast, the home of music industry know-how that will give you the skills to take your career to the next level. Here are your hosts, Bennett Ferguson and Stu Watts. What's going on, everyone?
Welcome.
It's another episode of the Marshall Street Podcast.
Yes.
Today, we're talking about progression over perfection.
Yes, we are.
So, being okay with where you're at the time, making sure you're documenting your journey, not keeping it to yourself, and also a bit of reflection is always important as well. But we'll get into that. First of all, what have we been doing?
Here at Marshall Street, well, we've had a big week. We've got Clacker. Michael
Clacker's
is back with us. He's our full-time videographer here.
Yep.
So he's slid back into the studio seamlessly.
Love to see it.
It's like he's never left. He's been away for about 2 years, and it is great to have him back. We've also got a youth program coming up this weekend, which we're stoked to start running. Hopefully we can get into a few more of them, but excited to kick the first one off of the year.
Yeah, and Josh Trabuzio's track is well on the way. We're pretty close to finishing that one. So keep your eyes peeled on that. It's going to be a banger. We're excited about that one. So, yes. So anyway, let's get stuck into it. So today, progression over perfection.
Yep.
So what do we mean by that? I mean, it's pretty obvious in the title, but, it's also, as an artist, you kind of can tend to get stuck in your own thoughts a lot of the time and stop yourself from doing things. And that's...
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, you've heard us say it before, but, we're going to go into a bit more depth on that now. So
yeah, I think it's like part of the artist, I guess, journey when you're first starting out. There's, we've talked about imposter syndrome, but it's very easy to feel like what you're doing isn't up to par or it's not good enough to show people. And when you do show others, people come up with excuses like, hey, check this out, but I did it in my room or I mixed it in my room. So they kind of try to justify why they think it's not up to a certain standard.
And comparing yourself to others is such a big deal when you're young and you don't have confidence.
Yep.
Or you're just starting out and you haven't really done it that often.
Yeah.
You kind of go, oh, it doesn't sound like this, but you're completely ignoring the journey that those people have been on in the past as well. So, when it's so hard when you're first starting because you don't have that perspective and actually going through all these, things that you have never seen before or things that catch you off guard. These are the important things that you actually need to go through to learn.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of like a paradox in a way.
Yeah. Contradiction is the meaning of life, as many have heard on this podcast before. But it's, exactly as you said, when you're first starting out, you don't have that perspective because you haven't been through it. And it's kind of like you need to go through these learning pains to be able to learn from it so that when you do this project or this track or this collaboration in the future, you've done that journey before to be in a better position to come up with a better product.
Yeah, and you hear people say a lot of what ifs, like, oh, what if this happens? And it's all just guessing. It's like you don't know what outcome is going to come from it, and therefore making that assumption of the worst is going to happen can be really damaging.
Absolutely.
And, not only stopping yourself from doing things, but getting yourself in this, spiral inside your mind that just can really get out of control really quickly.
Yep.
Within the space of minutes.
Yep.
You can be like, oh, I'm excited to do this. Oh, but what if this happens?
Yep.
Fuck, I can't do it. I'm not going.
Yeah, and then exactly right. And then, the internal dialogue within ourselves starts spiraling, and then before you know it, you've taken the energy out of something that could be really good.
Yeah.
And then, as you mentioned, being okay with where you're currently at. A lot of artists don't put out stuff at their start in their first 2-3 years, and I was guilty of the same thing because we don't think that it's, other people are going to listen to it and be like, wow, this is absolutely amazing. When I think it is equally important to show the journey that you get to being good at your craft as it is to actually getting good at your craft.
And for a lot of, bands and artists, their early stuff is sometimes their most artistic because they have the time to be able to craft it and practice it heaps. As you see, the classic sophomore slump is like such a classic thing to happen where bands and artists don't get as much time because they've been touring or, whatever else has happened after their success in the early years. they end up coming up with a second album that's kind of a bit weak or something like that. So really utilize those first few years of your artist journey by laying down as much as possible, experimenting as much as possible,
get weird
collaborating with different people.
Yep, because it's
learn as much as you can.
I think the part of the sophomore slump, in my opinion, comes back to expectation. You know, if you see some sort of success off a first release, suddenly in your mind you've built up this, well, we've got to put out something big. It's got to continue to prove it. And this is just
follow up,
pressures that we put on ourselves. And then you end up, you know, almost not doing yourself justice with the second release. When at the start, like, you've got creative freedom. You don't think you've got everyone watching of you. You're okay with being a little loose around the edges because you don't think there's these external pressures.
And it's really funny how that like quality argument comes into play with so many people when, you know, you're forgetting about half the people that love shit raw. Like, people love raw stuff that like is honest and not crystal clear and not perfect.
Super polished. There's
a big audience for that sort of stuff.
I think, well, for me, it feels more real. Like, a good song is a good song, regardless of, you know, if it's absolutely mixed to perfection and you've got the best, you know, recording engineer in the world. Like, if the song's good, you can tell.
There's so many artists and producers that I listen to that I'm more a fan of their early stuff just because they didn't know exactly what they had to do. You know, they're not walking into the studio being like everything's already set up, you know, having all their presets done. I mean, I talk a lot about, you know, organization and setting up your presets and all that sort of stuff, but that's more to allow you to be faster and more allowing you to be more creative.
Allow you to get to the creative process quicker.
Not to eliminate the work that goes into getting a good sound. You still got to take that time to experiment and find things out. You can't just go record, chuck a preset on it, it's done. Like that's completely eliminating that creativity aspect. And that in the first few years is where you can really just fuck around with stuff and just have fun with it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's like you've got to find the boundaries. It's like you've got to learn the rules to break them, like by experimenting and doing weird shit in the studio and, you know, collabing with a producer who's completely out of your genre. All these things just teach you perspective, lessons, how to go about your creative process. And then, you know, when it comes to 2, 3, 4 years down the track, all of a sudden you've built up all these great learning curves that have shaped you as not only a person, but an artist, someone who you can be in another room with. And then all of a sudden now you're in a position where you might make something that you consider industry standard, that, you know, that other people could resonate with and you can be proud to show other people.
And it's funny, we were talking this morning about like how people these days are blessed with YouTube and just so much free content that most of the content skips over that first learning area, and people want to charge money for that because that is where the valuable stuff comes in. It's the fundamentals. It's the learning the little things that make a big difference right at the start. That's where people are charging money for. So therefore, you're not really seeing as much free content of that sort of stuff on YouTube. You know, I use mixing as an example. You know, if you go to YouTube, you might see people like big time producers doing their thing and you kind of like don't really understand what they're really doing because you've skipped that part. But on the opposite side of that, there's a lot of artists that we see that want to skip that sort of period and go straight to being, you know, someone in the industry. And it doesn't work like that. You cannot skip that first few years. Because that is really where most of the learning happens.
That's your foundation.
And it takes time. Like you can't just expect to have everything in the first 2 months of mixing things, you know, or recording or songwriting or whatever it might be.
Same with everything. Like if it's sports, like if someone was to pick up a cricket bat or a baseball bat for the very first time and they expect to go and play state or for a national team within 3 months, 6 months, everyone around them would be like, hey man, those expectations are pretty ludicrous. But yet in something not tangible like music, people seem to think they can do it. When, you know, those early learning years are when you find out so much about yourself. And I think, as you said before, people want to skip those steps. or reminded me of an earlier podcast we did with Blushko, and he talked about that. And it's going on these incremental steps of progression. You can't skip any steps because let's just say even if you do skip some steps early, right? Say you've got a pretty good foundation and you were born with a great ear and you've got a natural knack for music. Suddenly you get into the room with, say, a bigger producer or a label and you skip some of those foundation steps. In a year, if that deal falls apart or that song doesn't hit and you've got to fall back on your foundational knowledge, because you skip those steps to get there, you're not going to be able to pick yourself up as well.
Starting from the start again.
Yeah.
And you have to learn what you skipped over anyway.
Yeah, and then not only that, but your ego has probably told you you're a little bit better and you don't need to learn these foundations because you've done these things.
Yeah, and then frustration kicks in.
And then that's when, we find...
People quitting.
Yeah, the mental illness side of it, whether it's depression, anxiety about what you're going through, that kicks in harder, and it's all just internal dialogue that we build.
Yeah, so I guess the main point that we're making is really appreciate those steps that you're taking right at the start.
Yep.
And learn as much as you can. Don't expect that you can, go from point A to Q
straight away.
Yeah.
Yep.
You have to go A, B, C, D, E. Like, learn as much as you can and don't take it for granted. Like, that is where the gold is, legit.
And that's, in my opinion, some of the funnest years. I remember when I was first starting out, you see interviews with artists and they talk about their come up and, how good it was back in the day before they had the external pressures of labels. And when you don't have that, in my mind anyway, I'm like, oh, that's not true. Like, when you get there, it's going to be fun. But then once we're, somewhat established now and you look back, the early years is when there's no expectations. You can't do any long-lasting damage to your brand.
Less serious?
Because you don't have your brand yet, There's no expectations on you, so you can get away with absolutely murder.
Yep.
So really, I guess it's having that perspective, that macro outlook on your career, just to be able to step back a little bit, have a bird's eye view, and just recognize and be comfortable with where you're at. Be like, hey, I'm an up-and-coming producer in the first 2 or 3 years of my career. That's where I'm at now. Yeah, if you go on to make gold records and platinum hits, those will come 5, 6 years down the track. Just being able to go, okay, I'm early on in my journey, and I'm okay with that, and I'm gonna have fun while I'm doing it.
Yep, absolutely. Another thing that is really important is that you are documenting what you're doing as you're going along.
Yep.
Gone are the days of the secretive artist.
Yep.
The Michael Jacksons, the behind the scenes ones that come out with a fully fledged show.
Yep.
Definitely the ones that have been doing that for 20 years, they still exist, no doubt. But people that are coming up now, it's not the same.
Yep.
You aren't just it's definitely a good idea to polish your craft before you take it to public, but document what you're doing.
Show your journey.
Yeah,
it's like,
show people what you're going through.
And I think for me that comes back to how we consume media these days. Like 30, 40 years ago when there was those big international pop stars such as Michael Jackson, the Spice Girls, all these ones, like the only media we had to consume was through television and radio.
Yep.
Prior to internet, Instagram wasn't a thing. Instagram stories weren't a thing, So Michael Jackson, they couldn't show their day-to-day through an Instagram story. That media channel literally didn't exist for us to consume it. So they had to put out media for the mediums that we used.
And the media that they did put out, whether it's a book, a CD, a movie, this is very tightly controlled by their management group, their creative directors, all this sort of stuff. It was a very intentional... we are going to make this person look like this.
Yep.
And with a budget and all that sort of stuff and the right people to have behind them, they really could create something that looked amazing.
Yep.
And that as someone that doesn't know them from a bar of soap, seeing that for the first time is really impressive.
Yep.
There's no doubt about that. But these days, if you're doing it that way, you're missing such long periods of time where you go silent.
Yep.
And people don't care.
Yeah.
People, and I was talking to Matt from $80 in Real Music yesterday about this. These days, we're still kind of stuck in that like product is the most important thing. Like a song, a video clip, right? Like people still think that these are super important things. Realistically, it's the opposite. If if you are someone that people are a fan of, they want to be seeing you every day.
Yep.
So therefore, it's unrealistic to be like, I'm going to have a song every day.
Yeah.
You know, some people attempt it.
Yeah.
but it's unrealistic,
Yep.
right? For the majority, for 99% of artists,
Yep.
it is unrealistic to think that you can have a product every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, the documenting of what you're doing every single day, whether you're in the studio, whether you're songwriting, whether you're hanging out with another artist, whatever that might be, showing people that stuff is where they can learn who you are.
Yep.
And that's how you build a fandom.
100%.
Yeah.
Like, people want to see the journey. So you've got to be okay to show the journey, you know, let that vulnerable side of you be seen.
Yep.
Be like, hey guys, like, you know, you might know that you're not the mix engineer or guitarist or DJ that you plan to be or you picture yourself being in the future.
Yep.
But be okay to show people where you're at now.
Yep.
Because not only will they, one, get to know you, what you're about, the sort of artist you're planning to be in the future, but they're going to see you progress along the way. And then in 2-3 years, if they've watched you from in your bedroom starting out on your first DJ decks to 3 years later playing big clubs, festivals, if they've seen that journey, they are so emotionally invested
Yep.
in you and what you're doing that
Yep.
they are a fan due to exposure.
Yep. For life.
Yeah, correct.
Yep.
Which brings us to a next point sorry.
Before we
sorry.
go on, the funniest thing about that point as well is you actually don't know what you're going to be in 5 years.
Yeah.
As an artist.
Great point.
You can change like 5 times in 5 years, you know,
Yep.
maybe more, maybe less, whatever.
Yep.
But you can change complete music styles, especially now where there's such a crossover of genres. Like,
Yep.
you don't know what you're going to be in 5 years. So you can't predict what you want yourself to be in 5 years.
Yep, and that just triggered a thought for me. One, and also, you don't know what the industry is going to be like in 5 years.
Yeah.
We don't know what platforms are going to be big.
Correct.
We don't know what sound is going to be hot in the
Yep.
clubs. You
Yep.
know, and I just thought of Sonny Moore from First to Last
Yeah,
when he
yeah,
crossed over
yeah.
to Skrillex. Can you imagine, like back then, there wasn't Instagram back then, Facebook was still kind of new. Can you imagine if Sonny Moore had documented him in the back of the tour bus on tour with From First to Last while he was recording and making dubstep for Skrillex? Like that, people now, you look back, you'd be like, this is amazing,
Yeah.
man.
Yep.
You've got this person who people pigeonholed into the emo alternative scene with his, you know, the MySpace fringe, and then came out and dropped some huge dubstep albums. If you could watch
Yep.
that journey, that would have been amazing.
Yeah, yeah. People love seeing that stuff. Behind the scenes stuff has always been the most awesome stuff anyway.
Yep.
So keeping that for one video,
Yeah.
where you've made a collaboration,
Yeah.
not a collaboration, a compilation video, you know, is ridiculous anyway
Yeah.
because people want to see more of it. So it's counterintuitive to keep a hold of all of this stuff and be like, I'm only going to show them
Yep.
when I've dropped my single
Yep.
or when I've done my video clip.
Yep.
I'm only going to let them see what I did
With
behind
them.
the scenes after I've dropped this.
Yep, it's the complete wrong mindset because one, you're putting something out there and you expect everyone else to see it in the same capacity and from the same perspective as you do,
Correct.
when no one else is going to see that.
No.
And you don't know what someone's gone through 15 minutes before they see that piece
Yeah,
of content,
yeah.
you know, which plays a big role in how they digest it. So, you know, they might have gone through a huge life experience and then hear your song about heartbreak and it's going to click, or they might have gone through this huge, you know, heartbreak moment and you've got a song about love and it's probably not going to gel. But if they've seen your journey before and after that, it doesn't matter if that one song didn't quite hit with them. They're in for the bigger ride.
It's more and more less about singular products
Yep,
and
100%.
items and
It's the
and,
whole,
you know,
the
yeah,
whole,
it's the whole picture.
It's the whole ecosystem that you build.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, the most successful artists are the ones that you're seeing in all these different areas. You're not just seeing them as a singer.
Yep.
You know, they're not just X. They're not
Yep.
just Y. Like
Yep.
they're doing a whole bunch of different stuff. And that way they're actually capturing a wider range of audiences. And also that's why there are so many genres that are crossing over.
Yeah.
Because they're starting to realize it was only the smart ones back in the day. This just triggered a thought. You know, things like Calvin Klein, for example. Back in the day, random, I know, but
Go with
back
it.
in the day, they would have crossover stuff where they would have, like a pair of underwear crossed over with like perfume. And if you look at this and you didn't know the brand, you'd be like, that doesn't make sense.
Yep.
Clothing and, you know, just as an example. But they were smart enough to be like, we're going to marry these two things together because we know that people need both of these things, right?
Yep.
Let's like compare that to music. You know, artists that are doing fashion or artists,
Yeah.
you know, they're not they're not very closely related, but somehow the artists that are marrying their passions, bringing things that aren't one thing, they're not just a singer, they might be a film star, they might be doing, you know, these things are easier to connect these days.
Yep, 100%.
And yeah, you're just widening your fan base potentially.
Correct, yeah. Like I mean, what pops to mind then is the lead singer of the Gallows. I forget his name, but he was a tattoo artist as well.
Yep.
You know, and in the heavy scene, obviously a lot of people are tattooed. Suddenly, you know, you might not like the tunes, but you could be a fan of his tats. And, you know, all these things just build that ecosystem around you.
Yeah.
And then the next part of that, I guess, from being okay with where you're at is going on that journey of 1%ers. Like being a little bit better each day will get you to your long-term goal. You don't wake up one day and suddenly improve 100%, you know? And as you know through mixing, like when you go to start mixing a song, you don't just put on a plugin
and the song
set it and it sounds amazing. Like it's just not how it's done. But especially, you know, mix engineers early on, that's why you find a lot of them overuse plugins and oversaturate things because they're trying to make these big improvements along the way. When it's not, it's those little 1% on each processing chain, that 1% on this compressor, which means the signal that EQ gets is a little bit cleaner. All that leads to a tighter product at the end. And it's the exact same in progression in anything.
Yeah, absolutely. If you are, you know, like we said before, you can't predict where you're going to be in 5 years, but it is important to be intentional about that you're moving in the right direction that you want to go, right?
Yep.
You're not taking on jobs or songs or anything that doesn't mesh with your brand right now. Maybe in 5 years it will, who knows? But being intentional about that sort of stuff will lead you in that closer to where you think that you might be.
Yep.
And it is the small steps. You know, you might each time look to collaborate with someone in just a slightly different area or just a slightly different genre. And then as time goes on, you're going a step further and a step further and trying different things, buying new plugins, mixing with something that you didn't expect that you would mix with, bringing a new keyboard in that you would never have tried. All these little things make up a bigger picture and, you know, your expansion.
It just broadens your
Seemingly
perspective.
in small steps, it doesn't look like you're doing too much. But if you look back 1 year to the year before and you've done all these things, you can go, fuck, I was doing it way different back then. Now this is part of my every day.
Yep. And that's how it should be. Like if you, you know, whether it's a videographer and you look back on the videos you edited a year ago, or you're a recording engineer and you listen back to how you recorded things a year ago, like there has to be that growth and it doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
So it's being okay with getting better 1% at a time. And then it comes back to being okay to document your journey. If you don't document your journey and put it out through all the media channels that we use, you're not going to have that point of reference to look back on in a year's time from now.
Yeah, and like it's also a good idea to look back on your past work and be like, how did I do things back then? Are there any things that I've left behind that maybe I shouldn't have? Are there any things that I do completely different? Like my example that I've been talking about like heaps recently is like I listened back to like some old mixes of like the Playbook, right? Because I've done the Playbook since 2014. I mixed their second EP before I was in the band. Then I joined the band and I've done all of our stuff since, right? But I listened to my mixes back, those early mixes compared to now, and I'm listening to drum sounds and I'm like, I don't think I could recreate that drum sound from back in 2015 compared to the way I do things now. And it's cool to be able to look back on that and go, man, I did things differently. And I was using different computer, I was using different plugins, I was using all this different stuff, and it created that product at that time.
Yep.
And it's cool to be mindful of that, because then you can go, like, if I'm thinking about that example, I'm thinking about that song and I'm like, oh, that had a really cool drum sound. I'm going to try and do that again next time that I do it, but with the knowledge that I have now.
Yeah.
And so same thing for songwriters, same thing for videographers. As a videographer, you might look back and go, I used to use that effect heaps, right? I don't use it anymore. But how about I bring it back just for like one little special effect or something like that? Songwriters, you go, I used to write those sorts of melodies all the time. Let's bring that melody back, and it might have some nostalgic feel to it. So it's really cool to be able to do that, and without having the releases, the regular releases or regular output and documentation of your journey, you won't be able to do that.
Correct. And that's not to say everything needs to go to the public.
Yeah.
You know, you can keep a vault for yourself.
Yep.
But that's still just important. That's documenting your journey. And that's a great point. Like I remember looking back on the days when I was in the DYE and Otis High. I look back on how we produced and made music back then. And I'm like, that was so completely stupid. Like it was 100%.
Yeah,
like the
go
way,
on.
Well,
Go expand on that. I want to hear.
well, I mean, I had no idea about music at the time, so I was coming in, and the other MC Zal, like he was the musical leader of the band. So
Yep.
everything I learnt was from under his wing, and he came from a band to a hip hop realm, and like so, I mean. You came in and mixed one of our EPs, and I remember you walking in and just fucking kind of tearing it apart. And why do you guys have 5 different crashes? And why do you have this? And in my head, I'm like, what is this dude? Like, what is he doesn't know hip hop? Like, this is it. And then you look back and you're like, we just didn't know what we were doing. Like, we stole, this obviously stealing samples from everywhere, but how we put things together, just in hindsight, made no sense and was a complete wrong way to go about it.
Inefficient.
Hold on, yeah, completely inefficient.
Yeah.
But what we did lean on, or what I certainly leaned on early on, was my small comfort zone of things that I knew. And then you overuse them, you oversaturate it.
Right.
And it's time like, if you're a videographer and you're like, all right, I know how to do time ramps and I know how to slow down stuff and I know how to, you're going to lean on that a lot because that's all you know. As you grow and you learn more things, you leave that behind because you're like, well, I've expanded now, I've gotten better. But that's not to say those stuff that you learn early isn't usable.
Yeah.
So then as you grow, you'll leave that back and you're like, all right, well, guess what? Maybe I lent on that part super heavily early, but that's not to say that there isn't a place for it further down the track.
Definitely not. And so recently I've been trying to export stems to set up for a mixing lesson type consultation thing that I'm wanting to set up in the future. So I'm analyzing all past mixes and past recording sessions that I've done in the past and taking them back to scratch so that when I have clients that I'm teaching how to mix, they can make their own mix built off of these raw recorded tracks that I've got. But by doing that, I'm actually sitting there and like taking all the plugins off that I
undoing your own work.
What my work was, but I'm also able to go, ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do that way now.
Cool.
But I've done it that way, and that led to that sound that I got on that recording.
Is there a specific one that you've seen in the last day or two?
Just like certain plug-in chains or a vocal effect, like a reverb effect or something like that. And the thing that's really important for me for mixing is always doing something new every single mix that I do.
Right.
I like to have something that is uniquely identifiable. I don't want to have something that sounds the same every mix. I just don't listen to producers that do things the same way every time. It kind of does my head in a bit.
That's really interesting because I know when I was back mixing and mixing like our tracks, usually before we realized they were bad and gave them to you, I would never have done that. Like I would never try something new on a track because in my mind I was like, well, this isn't the time for experimentation.
What I mean by that, I'm not doing everything brand new,
No.
but it's the overall picture of something.
Cool.
Right? So you're like, this song sounds like this, therefore I'm going to lean on these techniques to get it to sound more that way, right?
Yep.
Whereas, some other people might go, I want every song to be a similar sound, which is totally fine. I have absolutely nothing against it. And I definitely do that when I'm doing like an album or something like that. But what I mean is like, certain distortion effects might like complement a specific artist. So every artist that I work with has a different sound, so it's important to complement them. Anyway, long-winded, but I like to be able to go, ooh, that's a cool reverb effect that I used on that track. I might try that again in the future. And, you do things differently, and it's cool to look back on those past mixes and be like, yeah, fuck, that was cool. I used to do it that way. Anyway.
100%. But I think even, and just by, watching you and how you work, I think that mindset also goes hand in hand with how you look to upskill yourself constantly.
Yeah.
Because you always watch mix edits from, different mix engineers, CLA. So by you ingesting all this different information and trying to grow your knowledge and your skills, like to me that goes hand in hand with wanting to apply that in the real world. When I think, if if you're stuck in I guess a static mind state where you think you know things and you think you're comfortable and you think you've got all the, I used to call it the imaginary toolkit we've got because it's an intangible thing. We work with music. If you think you've got all the tools in your imaginary toolbox, you're not going to go out and study someone else to see what they do.
Yeah.
But because you do that constantly, it's no surprise that I hear you go, I try to implement new things in a mix.
Yeah, and it's funny that imaginary toolkit concept, because if you bring it back to a real life toolkit, it's kind of like being like a plasterer is never going to buy a new
tool, 100%. And that's
they learn, they figure out better ways of doing things.
Yep.
They go, oh, I was doing this, like it was taking me 2 hours. It could be taking me half an hour with this new tool.
Yep.
I'm going to try and improve my workflow.
Correct. If you're a tradie and you rock up with the same toolkit for 20 years, there's going to be someone out there that's beat you.
Yeah, exactly.
And, because technology advances, everything, there's more things available. It's like even some of the plugins that are available now would be unheard of 5-7 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's like if you're still mixing and doing these things the same way you were, you're limiting your growth.
Yep.
Because there's other things out there that you can just keep expanding your knowledge, which just expands you as a person and how you can work and interact with others.
Yeah, and if we bring that back to the title of the actual episode this week, progression over perfection, if you're limiting yourself to being like, I want to make this fucking kick-ass thing and it's going to take me 2 years to make and it's going to be epic, it's going to be so sick, you're leaving everything behind.
You're leaving everything on the table.
Yeah.
And personally, I hate the term perfectionism.
Yeah.
And when artists, especially artists starting out, say, "Oh man, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I had to do this." When I hear that, it's almost like this little trigger happens in my head.
Yeah.
Because I'm just like, dude, well, one, you're not a perfectionist. You just don't want to show people, or you've come up with something inside of you that doesn't want to release it, or
you've made this expectation of how you think it should be, and it's not meeting it because you don't have the skills. That's fine.
Yeah,
it's totally fine.
But then they've tried to counter whether this is a self-esteem issue or whatever it is by throwing out the title. Oh, the reason I'm a perfectionist, you wouldn't understand. I'm all about perfectionism, and it's like, dude, come on, and so that triggers me big time.
Yeah, that's funny
because no one's a perfectionism in anything. Yeah. There is things where you can take a lot of care about what you do because you're capable of a very good result, but that's just holding yourself to a high standard.
Yes, exactly.
What's perfect? What's reference to perfect?
Totally. And that's what I was saying before when I was saying you can't expect to come out of the gate this perfect band, and we see it quite regularly. We've heard people say that we respect, we've got to get this thing perfect before we can show anyone. That's exactly what I mean by, yes, you can have this high standard of showing people something that is of good quality, to when you come out of the gate. Absolutely. Have a standard, work towards it, but don't hold yourself back if you're not exactly there.
Yep.
Because something that could take 6 months to perfect, that little 10%, you're leaving the other 90% off the table.
Yep.
People aren't going to see it. Then you're irrelevant.
Correct.
And then you've got to start again.
Yep. And not only that little 10% that artists spend the extra 3 or 4 months on, that will limit them from putting it out. And then a lot of the times, as we've spoken in the last couple of podcasts, if you're not putting that same amount of attention and perfectionism into the release, it's going to get lost.
Yeah.
No one's going to see or hear it. And then you'll look back on a track from 2 years ago and you're like, well, we worked on this song for 8 months and we played around with the snare sample for literally 2 months.
Yeah.
And then we put nothing into the release of it and no one saw it. And it's like, did that matter? In the macro scheme of things, was how important was it?
And also, what percentage of people are actually going to notice?
No one.
Fuck all.
No one.
They're not.
And none of that
get over that mindset of, I have to make this to that point.
Yeah.
Make it to 75, 80, 85% there, get it out.
Put it out because people come up, and it's so funny, people come up with their own thinking about how an artist made it. So it's I see it all the time with rappers, and the consumer will hear a couple of bars from a song and then internalize it in their life and think that, all right, this is what the artist meant. And then you'll hear the artist talk about it. It's like, man, that wasn't what I meant.
I didn't even write it.
Yeah. It's more like, hey, dude, that wasn't what I was talking about, but that's not what I meant in it.
Yeah.
But as a listener, we digest it as if it's happening to us. So it's like you never know what someone else is thinking or how they're going to take something on.
Yep. Yeah, mate. Fucking oath. I guess to summarize, you need to be okay at the start with not being as good as you want to be.
Yep. Have fun. Like those should be the most enjoyable years of when you're first starting out. They should be the years when you're so excited and you're learning all this new stuff and it really just gets you in a positive feedback loop with yourself because you're like, man, I've found something that I can put all my energy in and this is really satisfying to me. Fuck what everyone else thinks. Like, this is fun for me.
Don't let that expectation of what you think other people are going to think of you, chances are they're not going to care.
Yep.
Chances are they're not going to care the way that you think they will. So therefore, get rid of that expectation of this is how people are going to see me. And that will really help you to release things more often without the fear of failure.
Yep.
Don't worry about it. So that's one of the main points.
Yep.
Make sure that you're appreciating every little step that you take.
Yep.
Because that is learning.
Yep.
The learning and being able to go along this journey and picking up little things here and there will allow you to get closer to your goals.
Yep. And even on that, I mean, we used to have like DYE appreciation, nights where once every 6 months or, a year, literally me, Slam and Zol would sit down instead of getting in the lab and working on anything new and being like, this is what's coming up. We'd go back and listen to all our own tunes, smoke some joints, have a couple of drinks and just be like, whoa, dude, we made this.
Yeah, it's fucking awesome. I love that. That's really cool. And it's something that we, not in that way, but every month here where we do a monthly reflection on how, what we've done in Marshall Street.
We've got one coming up this afternoon, actually.
Exactly. And it's not about like, we sucked here, this was awesome here. It's just, let's look at what we were able to do.
Yep.
And fully appreciate that we got some shit done this month.
Yep.
And the other 2 points, being able to reflect on your work is super important. And because of that, because of documenting it, you're going to be able to do that more easily.
So document the journey, Be okay with videoing yourself in a time that you think you're not the best you can be. Like, put that out there. If you go on and grow to be the person that you think you can, that will always be the time when you're on the journey there. It's like the early stuff, as I said to artists all the time, it's like no matter what this sounds like now, if you go on to be the artist and develop the career that you think you're on track to do, this will always be the early shit. Yeah. Doesn't matter how good this or how bad this is, if you go on to do what you think you're going to do, this will always be looked back on as the early shit.
Yep. And to just throw another little anecdote in there is it's like something that we see regularly is in relation to social media is people like, I'm going to wipe my social media and start fresh. And it's like, what are you doing? Every time I hear that, I'm like, be careful. Yeah. Don't delete everything.
See that? I've turned, actually, well, we'll continue the podcast a little bit.
I know.
Because I was 100% on that. And I used to look at it, I'm like, no, what are you doing? But now I can appreciate there is a spot for it, say around a big release or a big project. Yeah. Because it comes back to branding and marketing. We've done a branding podcast before. Yeah. If you've got if you've got a very intentional sound or brand that you're looking to put out for this project and it might not align with everything you've done previously, then I'm okay with it. Don't delete it, archive it because you can bring it back.
Yep.
But if you're wanting to paint yourself in a certain way because, you're looking for a label deal, or you're looking for a deal with a major, or you're going to market with a project, then you want all your social assets and your branding and your color schemes to be on point. So there is a place for it.
There's a place for it if you do it well.
Correct.
And
it's that place also is not in the early years.
Yes.
It's not in the first 3 years. It's not in the first 4 years.
Yep. But I thought I'd throw a little extra little.
Keep it going. And that's even on that. Like if you had said that to me 12 months ago, I would have been like 100% never get rid of it. Like keep it all
Yeah,
there,
yeah,
show
yeah,
everyone.
yeah, yeah.
But now, as you go on and I'm exposed to new things and my perspective grows as as an artist manager and as a studio owner, you can see it's like, all right, there is a place for that.
Yeah.
But you recognize that's just one tool in the imaginary toolkit.
Yep.
It's not something you lean. If you're wiping your Insta every 2 weeks because you think you need, then there's something wrong.
Yep. And I mean, look back at our early podcasts. They look way different than they do now.
Yeah.
And even today's a new setup where we're changing things regularly.
All the time. Like we're constantly tightening the screws.
Yep.
If we look back on the first podcast, and I know if we look back on the first 10 podcasts, we were just throwing shit at a wall to see what stuck.
We were using webcams.
Yeah, we had a third. We had Davey who was he was working here as well. Wasn't in the music industry at all, but we got his views and stuff, and it was all it was great, but because we didn't know what it was going to become.
And to an extent, who cares?
Correct. I'm not going to pull those podcasts down. It's not like, man, I don't want anyone to see this. That's the journey. If someone listens to that first podcast
get something
right
out of
through
it.
to now 43, they're going to see that journey of us as people, as a studio, and they're going to gain all that knowledge and information along the way.
Yep. Awesome. Well, I think we've talked enough for today.
This was a good one. Yeah, this one felt really good.
Yeah, absolutely. So as always, we forgot to mention this at the start, but if you're if you're new at seeing this, make sure you subscribe or follow on the platform that you watch it on.
Yep.
And as always, if you have found this, inspiring or informational, and you think that it might help someone else, please share it.
Yep.
We're not doing this for no reason. We really want to be able to show as many people as possible, and you can help by sharing to your friends. So.
Yep, absolutely. It's like getting this sort of, I guess, conversation started and pushing it around is exactly why we do it.
Yep, exactly. And thank you for watching. We always appreciate it.
And listening.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time. Peace.
Bye.